Hello, everybody. My name is Krzysztof Fornalski. I represent the Faculty of Physics, Warsaw University of Technology in Poland, and I would like to say something about the radiation adaptive response phenomenon, which is very related to adaptive response in space, because I think that it will be helpful in many aspects. First of all, a little bit very short information about the ionizing radiation, how it influences. We heard in previous presentation something about that. Generally, ionizing radiation can influence our DNA, which potentially can cause many detrimental effects, including deterministic effects, so quite quick effects, and stochastic. Generally, everybody thinks that ionizing radiation can make only bad things into our body, but this effect, what I would like to discuss, the radiation adaptive response, especially because this effect, called also radioadaptation, can implement some protective effects against ionizing radiation. Thanks to that, when we try to understand what's going on inside, what is connected with this effect, this potentially can help us to potentially protect astronauts. Why? Because adaptive response is an example of so-called non-targeted effect, and this effect generally is that we turn on some cellular protective and repair mechanisms which are enhanced due to low level of ionizing radiation. However, this effect is very complex, still not fully understood, and therefore we need to focus on that and make more and more research. First, research on that were conducted very early. It was during the Manhattan Project. Dr. John Rapper, he discovered that effect, and he called it recovery from radiation damage. He couldn't understand it correctly, because at that time our knowledge about the DNA repair mechanisms were not sufficient at all. So a few years later, another group confirmed his result. However, everything was in fact frozen. For next years, many research in that area were moved on another direction. In 80s, this idea came back to many research groups, and the term adaptive response was firstly used in that context in 1984. This was, let's say, a trigger for a lot of research all over the world. Therefore, in 1994, UNSCER, United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, published a report, the Annex B to that report, annual report, called Adaptive Response to Radiation in Cells and Organisms. And generally, this is the large review of all experimental issues of adaptive response at that time. UNSCER published another report many years later, but a very brief and quite interesting review. It was published just a few years ago, just concluded that radiation adaptive response is a complex response of the cell or the whole organism to ionizing radiation, which stimulates different mechanisms of various levels, like DNA repair mechanisms, antioxidant response, immunological response, apoptosis regulation, cellular cycle regulations, and so on. But as I said, those effects are quite rare and subtle, therefore it is hard to precisely determine them. So, simply speaking, not every experimental scheme shows this effect, and of course it is still interesting to be an excellent subject for the research. Based on the existing radiobiological data, we create our own mathematical model. We call it biophysical model, we don't have time to explain everything. However, this model is quite universal one and based on all biological findings. Generally, we can conduct two types of experiments regarding adaptive response. Two of them are most frequent, let's say, because they are easiest from the experimental point of view. One of them is to irradiate the organism or cells by constant, very low dose rate, which can be found in, for example, high background radiation areas, which are located all over the world, and of course in space. And the second is a so-called priming dose effect, called also the Yonezawa effect. Just few words about that. Let's assume that we have two organisms with the same conditions, and first organism will be radiated by high dose. We will observe many chromosomal aberrations, mutations, and generally everything bad. And 20 approximately hours, they will be irradiated by high dose, the same as the first organism, and we will observe that smaller. And this is called priming dose effect. It is a special case and most frequently experimentally evaluated case of the adaptive response phenomenon. The second case, what is more important in our situation, is a constant dose rate irradiation. So it is the situation when the ionizing radiation level is increased for some level, and this radiation is more or less constant. What does it mean? It means that the probability of adaptive response is increased. Therefore, we can potentially observe that for some organisms, the protection effects made by that stimulation can be observed. This can be also calculated mathematically using our model, and we have done it for the, as I said, high background radiation areas. This is our results. Those results are now submitted to the one of journal. It is not published yet. We collected data from 6 independent studies, 2 from Yangyang from China, 2 from Kerala from India, 1 from Ramsar in Iran, and 1 from Indonesia. So when you collect all those data, we can observe that the adaptive response is strongest at the level of 1 microsieverts rate. However, this result informs us that we can potentially focus on that aspect when we are looking at the radiation protection in space. This is, of course, strictly connected with so-called individual radiosensitivity, because it is the thing what we found as well, because maybe not everybody knows that every human being has individual radiosensitivity. So this...
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
There's some glitch once in a while, so it may be useful to turn your camera off, because it lasts for a second or two, but we're missing some words while you talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a second. Okay, is it better now?
Yeah, it seems fine now, and I can see your presentation, so go on, sorry.
Okay. Okay. So, as I said, the individual radiosensitivity is what everybody has. And this, as many other things, can be described by the Gaussian distribution. However, there is some disturbance in people who are, let's say, affected by some genetic predispositions. for example, people who are cancerous patients, that some of them has a very high radiosensitivity. So those two issues, I mean radiosensitivity or the opposite, radioresistance, can be connected with the adaptive response effect. And we try to look into that problem. Generally, there are some tests dedicated for astronauts. Here is two references which treat about that issue. First of all, test on blood lymphocytes in DNA double-strand breaks. It is the form of chromosomal aberrations among Russian astronauts, and the excellent paper by Professor Mortazavi, who proposed to in fact adapt very low dose rates for future astronauts those conditions. Of course, I think that it can be a little dedicated research should be carried on to check that idea, because he said that during the mission, chronic exposure to elevated levels of space radiation can considerably to and better protect astronauts against the higher level of ionization. And I think that there are three hypotheses in the literature till now. First is that radiosensitive individuals respond via adaptive response. Second, that radionormal individuals do that. And the third one, that radioresistant individuals respond in this adaptive response way. So our studies on the experimental data on the Ionezawa scheme showed that the stronger adaptive response, the weaker radiosensitivity. So generally, we found that the third hypothesis is the right one. So generally, at this moment, we support this third hypothesis, so that adaptive response can be observed for radioresistant people. What does it mean? That means that we should take some tests against radiosensitivity to test people if the level of their individual radiosensitivity. Thanks to that, people who are radioresistant, it is higher probability that they will respond the adaptive way, potential. So, quick conclusions. We have discussed the dose rate, so the constant level of radiation, which can be found also on Earth in high background radiation areas and in space. And low level of dose rate can induce adaptive response phenomenon. Many studies showed that. Of course, all those results are not consistent, because there are also some results which who do not show that effect. Therefore, it is still worthwhile debate about the adaptive response, if it's working or not. However, let's say when we are looking at data, approximately 45% are against adaptive response, 55 are pro-adaptive response. It is a little bit have to have. And our studies and earlier studies by Professor Mortazavi support the hypothesis that strong adaptive response can increase the protection of astronauts. It is hypothesis, as I said. This need many research in the future. I hope that our model, which is published, of course, in a few scientific papers, can help in those studies. Thank you so much. Here is my email and some references to our model. Thank you.